All right, let's dive in. Today, we're digging into the wild, messy, and frankly almost disastrous birth of Washington, D.C. So forget the marble monuments you know today for just a minute. This is really the story of how America's capital was born not with a bang, but with a splat, right into a giant mud puddle. See, you gotta understand, the dream here was absolutely spectacular. The founders were thinking big. They imagined a federal city that would rival the great capitals of Europe. This was going to be a shining symbol of the new republic's ideals: order, grandeur, and democracy, all laid out in a perfect, magnificent grid. But the reality? Yeah, a whole different story. And who better to sum it up than the city's own brilliant and, let's face it, totally frustrated planner, Pierre L'Enfant. He ended up calling his own creation a mere contemptible hamlet. I mean, it doesn't get much harsher than that, right? So you have to ask yourself, how did this incredible vision just completely fall apart? How did it collapse into a swampy, half-built financial disaster? Well, the answer is a crazy story of ambition, greed, and some seriously wild speculation. Okay, so let's really dig into the scale of this dream, because the expectations for this new federal city were, and I'm not exaggerating, completely off the charts. Wow, yeah, this chart, it really paints a picture, doesn't it? The prediction was for a bustling city of 160,000 people. But the reality, in 1800 when the government actually moved in, a tiny village of just 3,000. We're not just talking about a big gap here. This is a total chasm. And why was there such a huge disconnect? Well, it's because Washington, D.C. wasn't really being built as a capital city, you know? At its heart, it was America's first big speculative boomtown. The whole thing was less about building a nation and way more about trying to get rich fast off of skyrocketing land values. And this right here, this just perfectly captures that conflict. The vision was all about convenience, regularity, and elegance. But what did you actually get when you showed up? Miserable huts, brick kilns, and empty fields. It was a city with these grand, beautiful avenues on the map, but in real life, they were just giant, impassable mud pits. So, what was the fatal flaw? How did it all go so completely off the rails? Well, it was simple, really. The founders had this incredible vision, but they had no money, zero federal funds. Their big solution was a massive, high-stakes gamble based entirely on private land speculation. Okay, so you've basically got three groups of people here, and they all want different things. First, the founders, who just needed to get the city built. Then you've got the local landowners who had been farming tired tobacco fields and suddenly realized they were sitting on a gold mine, so they held out for the highest prices. And then came the speculators, guys like Robert Morris, the financier of the revolution no less, and his partner James Greenleaf, who just swept in promising the world. And what happened next is just a classic boom and bust story. It's wild. In 1793, this syndicate buys up 6,000 city lots, all on credit, promising to build houses every year. But here's the thing, these guys were gamblers, not builders. They built next to nothing. It got so bad that by 1795, even George Washington was fed up, complaining about their continual disappointments. And then the ultimate irony. By 1798, Robert Morris, the man who financed the American Revolution, was thrown into debtor's prison. The whole house of cards just came crashing down. And this quote from the Treasury Secretary at the time, man, it just says it all. There was no real economy. It was basically a failed pyramid scheme. And the few people who actually lived there were left in this desperate situation, just trying to survive. So all that financial chaos, it left a very real, very physical scar on the landscape. The grand capital became, and this is not an exaggeration, an empire of mud. I mean, can you imagine living there? It was grim. Those grand avenues were basically just muddy tracks cut through the woods that became totally impassable. People threw their garbage everywhere, so you had pigs and cows just roaming the streets. And to make it all worse, the low-lying areas were swamps, perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes and malaria. And you have to understand, it wasn't really a city in any sense we'd recognize. I love this description from the historian John Reps, who called it an archipelago of neighborhoods. Just imagine, a few houses over here, a single government building way over there, and in between? Just nothing. Wilderness. Isolated islands in a sea of mud and trees. Even years later, the reputation stuck. Charles Dickens visited and just laid into the place with this famously brutal but perfect assessment, calling it a brick field without the bricks. It just perfectly sums it up, right? All the ambition of a huge construction project, but nothing to show for it. And to top it all off, the few rules they did have were a total joke for the wealthy and powerful. There's this one famous story about a landowner named Daniel Carroll who accidentally builds his huge mansion 7 feet into the middle of what was supposed to be New Jersey Avenue. So what happens? The city planner, L'Enfant, does his job and has the walls torn down. And for his trouble, he's the one who gets fired. And Carroll? He gets a big payout from the government. Unbelievable. Okay, so the whole thing is a disaster. How do you fix it? How do you rescue a city that's basically failed before it's even begun? Well, after years of this chaos, the federal government finally figured out that private money wasn't going to cut it. They had to step in and clean up the mess themselves. And the solution, well, it wasn't glamorous. It came in the form of some pretty dry legislation called the Act of 1805. But this law was absolutely crucial. It was basically Congress's big attempt to finally tame the Wild West of DC real estate. Now, the process itself was, well, it was super methodical. Kind of boring, honestly. It was pure bureaucracy. But it was exactly what the city needed to get on its feet. Landowners had to get certified maps made. The city surveyor had to check everything and record it in a public book. It meant no more guessing, and definitely no more building your mansion in the middle of New Jersey Avenue. And look at the difference this made. You can see the whole transformation right here. You go from wild speculation to actual regulation. You go from flimsy, he said, she said boundaries to official legal surveys. But the biggest thing, the absolute game changer, was that for the first time, buyers could have certainty that they legally owned the piece of land they were buying. Now, this wasn't some quick fix. It didn't happen overnight. This was the slow, tedious, totally unglamorous work of government that finally laid the foundation for a real city to grow. It's what turned DC from this failed gambler's paradise into the capital we know today, one boring but essential property record at a time. So that really brings us to the big picture, doesn't it? When you think about it, DC's journey from a broke, muddy mess to a global symbol of power, it's just incredible. And it leaves you with this really interesting question. If this is what it took to build the capital city, with all the chaos, the greed, the big dreams, and the harsh realities, what does that tell us about the much bigger, and maybe just as messy, project of building a nation itself?